Imagine this, an arrogant receptionist at one of New York's most luxurious hotels trying to humiliate a guest dressed casually, not realizing she's actually Sandra Bullock. And to make matters worse, she has no idea that Keanu Reeves is about to walk through that door and flip the whole situation upside down. Trust me, you won't believe how this night ends. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. If you love stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow, we've got another jaw-dropping tale just for you. It was a rainy November night in New York City. The streets shimmered with reflections of neon lights as pedestrians hurried by, sheltering themselves under umbrellas. Among them, a woman walked alone, her hood pulled low to shield her face. The black cap she wore was subtle but purposeful, a barrier against prying eyes. It was Sandra Bullock, and though exhaustion weighed on her, her mind remained sharp. She was in need of a quiet place to rest before a major event the next day, but for someone like her, finding peace wasn't so simple. She approached the entrance of La Majestic, one of the city's most exclusive hotels. The moment she stepped inside, the air was filled with the soothing aroma of jasmine and vanilla. The elegant atmosphere spoke of wealth and discretion, polished marble floors, chandeliers that sparkled like stars, and the soft sound of a piano in the background. Sandra made her way to the reception desk, where a young woman named Heather, with perfect posture and a critical gaze, awaited. Heather raised an eyebrow as Sandra approached, taking in her simple sweatshirt and sneakers, not exactly the attire you'd expect from La Majestic's usual clientele. "Good evening, how may I assist you?" Heather asked, her voice cool but with an undertone of hesitation, already judging the woman before her. Sandra, keeping her composure, replied, "I have a reservation under the name Sandra Annette." Heather typed the name into the system, scanning the screen with a scrutinizing look. "Sandra Annette," she repeated, her brow furrowing. "We don't have any VIP reservations under that name." Red flags went off in Sandra's mind, but she remained calm. "I can show you the reservation confirmation," she offered, pulling out her phone and showing Heather the email. Instead of immediately looking at the screen, Heather sighed and then took the phone in a way that clearly suggested she wasn't impressed. Sandra could see it now, the judgment, the dismissive attitude. Heather glanced at the screen, then muttered, "Let me check again," with a clear layer of sarcasm in her voice. Sandra's patience was wearing thin. She just wanted her room, but she could tell Heather had already decided she didn't belong. As Heather typed again, an uncomfortable silence filled the space, and a few guests started to notice the tension. Then Heather, with a sharp edge to her voice, made a comment that would change everything. "This hotel is for exclusive clients. Perhaps there's been a mistake." The implication was obvious. Maybe Sandra wasn't important enough to stay here. Sandra blinked, taking in the words. She was used to being recognized everywhere, from airports to coffee shops, but here, at La Majestic, she wasn't being treated like a VIP. And Heather had no idea just how wrong she was. The receptionist kept typing, trying to maintain her composure, but Sandra could see the growing discomfort in her expression. Heather repeated the name, Sandra Annette, tilting her head slightly as if she were about to solve a riddle. But Sandra knew what was happening. This wasn't an error. Heather didn't want to find her reservation. With a tight smile, Sandra unlocked her phone and once again offered the confirmation. But would it even matter? What happens when someone thinks they know everything, but they have no idea who they're really dealing with? Stay tuned, because the real story is just about to unfold. Sandra pulled up the email and held her phone toward Heather, but the receptionist barely glanced at it before letting out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, of course. Let me check again," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Sandra could sense Heather's discomfort growing. The receptionist wasn't following protocol. She had already made up her mind that Sandra wasn't deserving of the VIP treatment. As Heather's fingers clicked across the keyboard, Sandra knew she wasn't actually looking for anything. She was stalling, playing a game of power. Heather crossed her arms and shot Sandra a sharp look. "Are you sure the reservation was made here, at La Majestic?" The question wasn't genuine, it was an insult. Sandra felt frustration bubbling up, but she kept her voice steady, firm. I'm quite sure. Heather's smile twisted into something cold. Well, our system doesn't show any confirmation under your name, but I can recommend a more affordable hotel a few blocks from here. It was like a slap to the face. Sandra didn't flinch, but she could feel the shift in the air. People were paying attention now. The couple by the fireplace stopped talking. The man at the bar lowered his drink, curiosity sparking in his eyes. Heather wasn't just denying a reservation, she was rejecting Sandra herself. Sandra met Heather's gaze, her voice cool but with a steel edge. You didn't even check the system properly, did you? Heather blinked, thrown off for a moment. I'm just following procedures, ma'am. If you'd like, you're welcome to wait while I verify again. Sandra could see through it. Heather was trying to win this power struggle, but Sandra wasn't about to play along. Is your manager available? She asked, her patience running thin. Heather's smirk grew ever so slightly. He's busy, but I can try checking again, she said, turning her monitor as if she were actually looking something up. But Sandra saw the reflection in the glass. Heather's screen was still on the home page. She wasn't searching for anything. The irritation burned in Sandra's chest, but just as she was about to say something, a sound made her pause, the faint click of a camera shutter. Sandra's eyes darted to the bar, where a man in a suit was holding his phone low, pretending not to take a photo. He recognized her. And if he recognized her, others would too. Sandra's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't just about a botched reservation anymore, this was about exposure. Heather sensed the shift in Sandra's expression, her smile turning into a subtle, knowing smirk. Miss Annette, why don't you wait in the lounge while we sort this out? I'm sure we can find something for you, she said, her words dripping with forced politeness. Before Sandra could respond, another receptionist approached and whispered something to Heather. Heather's gaze flicked between Sandra and the man at the bar, her suspicion growing. She glanced at Sandra's phone again, but this time, the realization hit. The woman she had just humiliated wasn't who she thought she was. Then, the hotel doors swung open with a force that commanded attention. A cold gust of wind swept in, raindrops following in its wake. Every head in the room turned, and even the security guard at the door straightened up. The man who walked in was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his crisp white shirt slightly damp from the rain. His presence shifted the atmosphere in the lobby, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. His gaze swept over the lobby, taking everything in, and within seconds, it landed on Sandra. The briefest exchange of glances between them spoke volumes. Without hesitation, the man walked toward her, ignoring everyone else. The lobby fell into complete silence as he approached. He stopped in front of Sandra and, with a knowing smile, spoke softly, "Is everything good here?" The impact of his words was immediate. Heather froze. She didn't need to ask who he was. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he was. And in that moment, Heather understood her mistake. Keanu Reeves stood there, calm and composed, his presence overwhelming. He looked at Heather, then back at Sandra, his voice laced with subtle amusement. "Did I take too long?" he asked, his words hitting like a shockwave. Heather blinked, unable to process what was happening. The woman she had dismissed and humiliated just minutes ago was now speaking with Keanu Reeves, with an ease and familiarity that shattered all of Heather's assumptions. Sandra let out a slow breath, a small smile tugging at her lips. And just like that, the tables were turned. "Oh, you know how much I love a good patience test," Keanu said, his eyes sparkling with a knowing look. The lobby of La Majestic was still, as though the entire room had collectively stopped breathing. The power dynamic had shifted in the blink of an eye. Heather, once so confident and in control, now stood frozen. Her face was stiff, her mouth opened, but no words came out. A couple near the fireplace exchanged stunned glances. Emily, the woman with the brown hair tied in a casual bun, whispered, nudging her husband's arm. "David, look," she added, her voice tight with disbelief. David, who had been watching with mild curiosity, frowned. He glanced between Sandra and Keanu, his eyes widening as realization dawned. "Oh my God, I think it's her," he whispered. The shock on David's face was mirrored in Emily's expression. She swallowed hard and added, "Maybe she's just trying to have a quiet night, and look how that turned out." They both looked over at Heather, whose eyes were locked on Sandra, wide and unblinking. It was clear now, Sandra Bullock wasn't just any guest. And Heather had just treated her in the most humiliating way possible. At the bar, the same man who had secretly snapped a photo earlier now held his phone again, weighing his options. Should he take another photo? Start recording? Because whatever was happening here was about to become a scandal. Heather tried to recover. She straightened her posture, cleared her throat, and forced a smile. I am sorry, sir," she stammered, turning to Keanu. "Of course, I'll check again." Her fingers danced over the keyboard, but this time, each keystroke felt like a blow to her pride. Keanu stood beside Sandra, arms crossed, waiting patiently. Sandra said nothing, but her gaze remained on Heather. There was no anger in her eyes, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from being in these kinds of situations so many times that it no longer surprises you. Finally, Heather found the reservation. Relief flooded her face as she turned the screen toward Sandra, her fingers trembling. "Here it is," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just a system error." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "A system error," she repeated, her tone flat. Heather turned bright red, and Keanu, who had been calm up until now, let out a short, humorless chuckle. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, and the hotel manager appeared, looking pale and anxious. He quickly surveyed the scene: Keanu, Sandra, Heather. He didn't need to ask what had happened, he already knew. The lobby held its breath, waiting for Keanu's response. Heather, desperate to salvage whatever dignity she had left, turned to the manager, forcing a smile. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize for any confusion," she said, her voice now unnervingly high-pitched. "We're resolving everything. Miss Annette, I assure you, your stay will be perfect." But as she looked back at Sandra, something shifted. She saw it then, the way everyone else was looking at her. The couple by the fireplace. The man at the bar. The security guard by the entrance. They had all witnessed her humiliation, and there was no undoing it now. Keanu took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. Heather's stomach twisted. "I believe my friend has a reservation here," Keanu said, his voice still soft, but with an undeniable authority. Heather swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. Aye, of course, sir, I'll check," she stammered, but Keanu cut her off. "No need," he said, stepping closer, his calm presence now exuding quiet power. Sandra remained still, her expression unreadable, but Keanu's eyes spoke volumes. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his damp hair, clearly tired of the entire charade. The room was silent, the tension thick. The manager, his face pale, looked ready to faint. Heather's coworker, who had been typing at a nearby desk, was now staring at her with a mix of pity and apprehension. Keanu didn't move. Sandra didn't either. Heather blinked rapidly, trying to regain her composure. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding," she said, her voice shaking. "We're resolving everything now." She forced a nervous laugh, but it died halfway through. No one laughed. Not Keanu. Not Sandra. Not anyone. The security guard, who had been silently observing everything, finally took a step forward, his gaze sharp and steady. It was clear Heather had lost all control. And the damage was done. It was a look of sheer disappointment. The manager's eyes lingered on Heather, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "You're not just a receptionist, Heather. You represent this hotel. You represent its reputation," he said softly, but the gravity of his words made them feel like a hammer strike. She wanted to respond, to apologize, but her voice was caught in her throat. She knew there was no excuse for what she'd done, and no words would undo the damage she had caused. Keanu had walked away, and Sandra, without a word, had disappeared with him into the elevator. The entire room seemed to exhale collectively, and even the faint sound of the piano in the background couldn't mask the tension in the air. The guests who had witnessed it all still stared at Heather with pity and judgment. The man at the bar, the couple by the fireplace, even the security guard at the entrance, all their eyes were locked on her, and none of them would ever forget what had just happened. Heather's hands were shaking, and she was no longer sure if she could even face her own reflection. She had been the one in control just moments before, but now she was nothing more than a figure of scorn, trapped in a situation of her own making. The manager, now standing beside her, didn't need to say another word. He had already made up his mind. "Go to the back office," he ordered, his voice colder than it had ever been. "I'll take care of the rest." But Heather didn't move. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the polished wood of the reception desk as if it could offer her some kind of salvation. She had made a mistake that would haunt her for a long time. She had humiliated one of Hollywood's brightest stars, and now that mistake was immortalized for everyone to see. When she finally glanced up, she caught the eyes of the hotel staff around her. They were all avoiding her gaze, but the pity in their eyes was palpable. She knew the rumors were already starting to spread. By the time she left, the whole hotel would be buzzing with what had just happened. And worse, the world would know. In the days to come, the story of Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves at La Majestic would be shared countless times across social media, news outlets, and gossip columns. But what would be remembered most was the arrogant receptionist who had tried to dismiss them both, only to be shown the consequences of her actions in front of the entire world. Heather felt a deep, gnawing weight in her chest, the consequences of her arrogance settling in like an anchor. She had been given an opportunity to make a lasting impression, to treat every guest with the same respect, no matter who they were. But she had failed. And that failure would follow her for the rest of her career. As the last of the guests filed out, their murmurs of disbelief and judgment still echoing in her ears, Heather finally turned toward the back office, her head bowed. She knew she had just learned one of the most important lessons of her life: no one is too insignificant to be treated with respect. The decision was final. Heather felt the weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone, suffocating her. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. Mr. Williams, who had once been a distant authority figure she had carefully navigated around, was no longer looking at her. His gaze was locked onto the screen, where the viral photo of her public humiliation of Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves flashed in front of him. The truth was undeniable now, everyone knew. She could hear the soft hum of the computer in the background as Mr. Williams remained silent, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The silence was unbearable. Every second stretched on as though time had stopped entirely. And then, his voice cut through the stillness, sharp and final, the sound of it echoing off the walls. "Pack your things, Heather. You're done here." Her stomach dropped. The words hit her like a physical blow, but she couldn't move. She had spent years building her position at La Majestic, grinding her way up the ladder. Her confidence had been hard-earned, cultivated through hours of work, diplomacy, and effort. All of it had been for nothing now. One single moment of poor judgment had shattered everything. The reality of it closed in on her, suffocating her in the same way she had once felt in control of the luxury hotel's pristine reputation. She wanted to shout, to scream, to beg for another chance, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. There were no excuses left to offer. The evidence of her mistake was everywhere, on social media, and the comments already flooding the viral post, in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed the spectacle unfold in the lobby. There was nothing left to hide behind. "Please," she whispered, the word a fragile, breathless plea that carried no weight in the heavy silence between them. "Please, no." But it was too late. Mr. Williams didn't react. His face was stern, resolute. His gaze was not one of anger, but of disappointment, and even harsher punishment. "You knew the rules, Heather. And you violated them. You treated a guest with disrespect, and not just any guest, Sandra Bullock. Do you even realize how much damage you've done to this hotel's reputation? How much damage you've done to your reputation." Heather's throat tightened as the words sank in. She wanted to speak, to explain, but she had no words to defend herself. The truth was out. She had crossed a line, and no amount of pleading could erase it. Mr. Williams shook his head, his disappointment now palpable, and turned his attention back to his computer, signaling that the conversation was over. There was nothing more to discuss. Heather stood there, frozen, as the gravity of the situation finally sunk in. Her hands trembled at her sides, and for a brief, desperate moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. But this was no dream. This was real. The harsh reality of her actions was crashing down on her with the weight of 1,000 regrets. The mistake was irreversible. Her career at La Majestic was over, and the world would soon know it. The room was thick with silence, the only sound Heather's shallow, labored breathing. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. What was there left to say? She had no defense, no justification that could change what had already been set in motion. Finally, Mr. Williams broke the silence, his voice clipped and cold. "I'll have security escort you out." Heather didn't protest. She couldn't find the strength to do so. Every ounce of her energy drained as she turned and walked toward the door, her legs heavy with the weight of failure. Each step felt like it took her further away from the life she had known, the life she had worked so hard to build. The door behind her closed with a soft click, and the echo of it seemed to reverberate through her mind as she stood in the hallway of La Majestic. The silence in the corridor was deafening, crushing her under its oppressive weight. She had been the center of it all just hours ago, standing proudly at the reception desk, confident and poised. Now, she was nothing. She was just another disgraced employee being quietly ushered out of the building, her future now uncertain. As she made her way toward the back exit, a deep sense of loss settled over her. How had everything unraveled so quickly? Just hours ago, she had been standing behind that desk, her confidence and authority unquestioned. And now? Now she was walking out the back door with nothing, no job, no pride, no dignity. She had thrown it all away for one moment of petty arrogance. The consequences of her actions had spread quickly, faster than she could have imagined. Social media was already lighting up with screenshots of the post, the comments flooding in. The Majestic Receptionist tries to humiliate Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves steps in to shut it down. Her name was out there now, and not for anything good. She would forever be known as the woman who tried, and failed, to take down one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. The scandal would follow her long after she was gone. And deep down, she knew that this wasn't just a career setback. It was a stain on her reputation that would never wash out. When Heather stepped out into the cool night air, she felt the weight of the world press down on her. The night seemed darker now, as though the sky itself had turned against her. She could no longer hide from the reality of her situation, and there was no way to escape the fallout from her actions. She had burned every bridge, and now, all she had left was the empty, bitter taste of failure. In the end, La Majestic would go on without her. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves would continue to be admired and respected. And Heather? She would just be a footnote in the hotel's history, remembered for one thing, the woman who tried to humiliate Sandra Bullock and lost everything in the process. Heather left the office in a daze, her vision blurred by the tears she had tried so hard to hold back. Every step she took toward the exit felt like a journey to a place she couldn't escape from. She walked past the familiar grand entrance of La Majestic, her conscience weighing heavier than she ever thought possible. The guests in the lobby stared at her, their eyes like daggers. She avoided their gazes, but it didn't matter, she knew they all knew. Her failure was written on her face, in the way she moved, in every corner of the hotel. When she finally reached the door, she paused for a moment, a brief second of hesitation before she stepped outside into the rain. The security guard stood at his post, watching her without saying a word. His expression said everything that needed to be said. No words. No sympathy. Just the cold truth of what had happened. Heather didn't bother to shield herself from the rain. It was a small, unimportant detail now. Her jacket was already soaked, but she didn't care. She didn't care about anything. She kept walking, without direction, just walking. There was no purpose anymore, no place she was headed. She wasn't the receptionist of La Majestic anymore, she wasn't someone important. She was now a cautionary tale, an example of how arrogance can destroy a career in a heartbeat. She had judged Sandra Bullock without knowing who she was, and the world had shown her just how quickly things could unravel. Back inside the hotel, life moved on. The front desk had changed shifts. The manager had given strict orders to ensure Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves received nothing less than the best. There was a new sense of urgency, a new awareness of just how important it was to treat all guests with respect, no matter who they were. Emily, the woman who had recognized Sandra earlier, was still there, talking with her husband in hushed tones. She shook her head, still in disbelief. "I bet Heather will never judge someone by their appearance again," Emily said quietly. David, her husband, chuckled softly, taking a sip of his wine. "If she even gets another job anywhere, that is." Emily glanced toward the elevators, where Sandra and Keanu had disappeared hours ago. "She had no idea who she was dealing with," Emily muttered, shaking her head. And that night, Heather learned the hard way that respect always comes before arrogance. Meanwhile, Sandra Bullock sat at the edge of the massive king-sized bed in her luxurious suite. The exhaustion from the trip was finally catching up to her, but the scene in the lobby replayed in her mind over and over. She ran her fingers absently over the crisp white sheets, lost in thought. Across the room, Keanu stood by the window, gazing at the illuminated city below. He broke the silence first. "She got what she deserved," he said, his voice calm but firm, without looking away from the view. Sandra sighed softly, nodding. "Maybe. But what really bothers me isn't what she did to me. It's knowing that this happens to people all the time, people who don't have someone to show up and save them." Keanu turned his gaze from the skyline to study her face. There was a far-off look in her eyes, a weight in them that only someone who had experienced true injustice could understand. He moved to the armchair across from her and sat down. "You know you can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, right?" Sandra gave a small smile, appreciating his concern. He continued, his voice soft but meaningful. "You probably don't remember this, but when I was just another struggling actor trying to make it, there was an event, a party, one of those places full of important people. You were one of the only ones who stopped to talk to me like I was someone who mattered." Sandra froze for a moment. She tried to pull the memory from her mind, but she couldn't quite recall that exact moment. But the truth of what he was saying resonated with her. It felt like something she would have done. She swallowed, touched by his words, a warmth spreading in her chest. Keanu smiled gently, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe now it's my turn to return the favor," he said softly. The next morning, when Sandra and Keanu came down to the lobby, the energy in the air was different. The staff was quieter, more reserved. The hotel manager, clearly uncomfortable, hurried over to them, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock, on behalf of La Majestic, I would like to offer you a complimentary stay and a special dinner as an apology for what happened." Sandra simply smiled politely, glancing briefly at Keanu. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. Williams, but I think this time we won't be staying any longer." The manager's smile faltered, his discomfort evident. Keanu picked up his own luggage, following Sandra toward the exit without a word. As they passed through the lobby, a few staff members lowered their heads discreetly, avoiding eye contact. They knew. They had witnessed everything. As the car carrying Sandra and Keanu glided smoothly through the streets of New York, the city lights reflecting off the windows, Sandra broke the silence. "Do you think Heather learned anything?" she asked, her voice light but thoughtful. Keanu sighed, resting his arm on the back of the seat. "She had a choice, learn from it or drown in her pride. It's up to her." Sandra let out a soft laugh, her voice warm with a hint of amusement. "Do you always have this zen view of things?" Keanu shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. I've seen a lot in this life. I know that some people never change, but others just need a shock to see the world differently. As Sandra continued her trip, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down and saw a message from a friend. It was a video. She smiled softly, still holding the phone in her hand. "What is it?" Keanu asked, curious. Sandra shook her head, still smiling. "Nothing. Just a little seed being planted." Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. "See? I told you it would make a difference." And with that, the car continued its journey, and Sandra's smile remained, the kind of smile that spoke of the subtle but undeniable power of kindness, of showing people who they really were before jumping to conclusions. The world would never forget Heather's mistake, but Sandra knew that sometimes the best way to learn was the hard way. And maybe, just maybe, Heather would someday find a way to rebuild herself. If she could swallow her pride and let the lesson sink in.